Okay, so before we go into the next section of the logic model, just want to see if there were any questions that came up for folks that might be helpful, for the full group to hear that we can try to answer. Anything that came up for you? Questions or even helpful tidbits for folks that are maybe starting their logic model? Yes?
I have a question for you. I noticed that some agencies are moving to theories of change as opposed to logic models.
Yes. Yeah, so definitely the theory of change language is being used more. And my take on it is that a logic model is simply kind of a graphical representation of your program's theory of change. Because if you really think about it, it's your theory, it's your idea for how your program is going to work. Theories of change can be a narrative statement, and they can go into a lot more detail about exactly how certain activities will then lead to specific results. So it can be much more detailed in some ways than a logic model in that narrative format. But I think at kind of a simple level, a theory of change or a logic model is more of that graphical representation of a theory of change. Yeah, does that help? Great. It's a great question. And there's so many, with the terminology, it's always kind of changing, and sometimes it's hard to sort of keep up with it all, and it can definitely be confusing. Other questions that came up as you worked on your logic model? Okay, well, we will move on then to the next section. Let me go ahead and jump past that one. Okay, so you've worked on inputs and activities, and now we want to be thinking about, okay, how are you showing your impact in terms of your outputs and your outcomes? Okay, so somebody had just asked me, okay, what is the difference between outputs and outcomes? And I know that can sometimes be a little confusing. So with outputs, it's helpful to think about that as really what your program produces in terms of kind of the reach of your program, the scope of your program, and it can track various aspects of program implementation. So the most common output is number of participants served, right? You oftentimes see that. It can also be things like attendance rates. So was it that 80% of your participants attended, all hours of your programming? So getting information there on reach and scope. Oftentimes you'll also see satisfaction as an output. So it might be that 90% of your students, enjoyed or were satisfied with programming, or X number of family members were satisfied. Right? So those are outputs. They are important to measure, but they are not the actual change or result. And that's the difference between an output and an outcome. Outcome then is really about the change. So if just by saying 50 students attended your program, right, that's helpful. I mean, you're serving 50 kids, but then you have to take it a step further and say, well, what did they get from this? What did they gain? What were the results? Okay, so then with outcomes, again, we've been talking about this as changes or results, and there are different types of outcomes. So short-term outcomes are some of those initial changes that you would see from your participants. So that could be things like changes in knowledge or skills or attitude or awareness. It's those first changes that you're going to be seeing. And then later on, you might have some of those more medium or intermediate changes. That could be something like behavior. If you teach someone and then it actually leads to a specific change in behavior. And then finally, long-term might be those more ultimate outcomes that you're hoping for. Some folks actually use the term impact for that. So a long-term outcome and an impact can be the same thing. So a quick example of this, and I apologize, this is not a STEM example, but I think this is a helpful way to kind of think about short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. Let's say we're a nonprofit organization that is providing health services in the community, and we're working with folks who've maybe recently been diagnosed with diabetes. And as part of that programming, you're doing, as a first step, some initial education, maybe about certain food choices. So what are foods that are on the low glycemic index, right? So you're imparting that knowledge to your participants. So that's a short-term outcome. Have they increased their knowledge? Do they know more about sort of healthy eating habits, that kind of thing? And then later on, that might lead to an actual change in the type of foods that they are eating, so leading to that behavior change, which then finally might ultimately lead to improved blood sugar levels, and that would be more of that long-term change in status or condition. Now for your program, particularly with it's my understanding with this summer programming, it may be primarily the short-term outcomes that you're achieving. You might not have those long-term outcomes because your program is only running for a limited time, and that's okay. And would also just encourage you not to get too hung up at this point about, well, what's a short-term outcome or what's a longer-term outcome? You know, just be thinking about what are those results, what are those changes that you're trying to achieve with your participants, and then you can go back and kind of make some decisions about, okay, this is more shorter term, or we need to do this first, right? We need to maybe impart this knowledge before it would lead to this particular new skill.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, for the purpose of this RFP, right? Let's say you feel that we can deliver certain outcomes, right? That's our hypothesis. Of course, those would be short term. Should we define longer term outcomes and a methodology for keeping for tracking that, or would we be held accountable to that? How does that actually work with the RFP process?
Lauren and Melanie, is that because you all have more expertise, obviously, with this specific process? Is that something that you can address?
Well, for last year, all the logic models had short-term and long-term, and then we only took the short-term outcomes to make you actually accountable for them in the evaluation matrix. But then you are welcome to have those longer-term outcomes. So we're definitely interested in seeing how you're looking at that, because that also speaks to your financial sustainability and your vision as an organization and your place in STEM. But you're not literally held accountable for your evaluation.
I have a comment instead of saying we're from Haley.
Okay.
One of the things that we're looking for is in the criteria section of the RFP as part of the online application, is we're looking for connection, pathway connections. Kind of like our yarn activity. So that might be a longer term thing that you could say you're maybe building a relationship with, if you do a middle school program, you're building a relationship with a program that has high school. So there is a pathway for each student. That might be an example of a long term when we're looking for that kind of thing relative to yarn and ecosystem.
And Melanie, would that be, just to clarify, documented in the RFP application, but it could also be in the logic model?
Yeah, it would only be in the logic.
Only be in the logic model.
You could say it in the application too, but the word count is limited, so we can put it in the logic.
Okay.
I just was gonna kind of say similar to what Melanie said, is like, I think looking at short-term outcomes to be really specific about how you're holding yourself accountable for the summer. So you can say we either met this goal or we didn't, but then also as funders, I think we're gonna start pushing harder on looking at what's the bigger picture and how are you ultimately making sure, like, I assume that your bigger goals are not just like somebody does science for one summer, that you ultimately want more kids to go into STEM careers, or like some bigger, more graduate from high school at higher rates, or take more AP tests, or I don't know what it is, but these bigger things. And so I think incorporating that will help as we further push to figure out how the programs fit together. Like Melanie was saying with the string activity, how do you might be playing a specific role in a much bigger outcome. And even though your bigger outcome is not necessarily all yours to own, you're trying to say, my program is ultimately going to get here, but I need all these other programs to also be doing other things too. The ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think like in the example of, you know, wanting more students to pursue a career in STEM, you know, your piece of that could be that you're introducing them through field trips. Or, you know, other means to different types of careers. Maybe they're meeting with engineers, and that's kind of the piece that you're playing in a short-term outcome, and you could certainly measure some of those outcomes short-term that would then hopefully lead to actually more students in kind of the pipeline to pursue a career. Does that help? Okay, great. Okay, so also with outcomes, thinking about when you're developing your outcomes, are they specific and are they going to be measurable? So just as a quick example of that, at the top here, an outcome of, okay, students read better, right? And you can ask the question, well, is that measurable? So then let's refine that a little bit. Students improve their test scores or their reading test scores. Okay, yes, that's something that we could measure specific. And then finally thinking about the target. So that 20% is your target. So students improve their reading test scores by 20%. That's what you are sort of working on achieving through your particular program. So as you're going through your outcomes, if you haven't already, particularly if you developed one last year, be thinking about, do you have targets related to those outcomes? Because we want to see that your outputs and your outcomes are, again, specific and measurable. And I'll give you, in just a second, we've got an example logic model to show you that. Okay, and then finally, and this ties back to the conversation we were having actually earlier about short and long-term outcomes. So it sounds obvious, but wanted to share again that the more intermediate kind of the outcome, the more influence a program generally has. So if you're wondering, okay, should this be a short-term outcome or is this something longer term, then ask yourself the question, can our program have a significant or substantial influence on that outcome? Right? So that's helpful to really think about, can your program influence this outcome? And if so, then that's going to be something you want to track and sort of be held accountable to. Where you don't have as much influence, that might be more longer term. So for example, if you're working with elementary school students, and ultimately you want to see these students graduate from high school, right, or maybe go on to college, but your program directly maybe doesn't have as much influence on that as it does on increasing engagement, increasing their skills in certain areas, but ultimately you want to hopefully through the work of really the entire community see that that long-term outcome of graduation from high school is occurring. Does that make sense? Okay. Next. Okay, so just a quick example, and this is obviously a very simplified logic model, but as you work on the rest of the outputs and outcomes section, I think it can be helpful to just see that we've got our resources there, getting specific about who is serving as your instructors, what sort of curriculum you're using, the specific activities, and that they've clarified that it's 250 hours of programming, so some dosage information there. And then your outputs, that they're tracking attendance and number served. And then finally, the specific information about outcomes in terms of increased interest in STEM, and then demonstrate increased STEM skills. And if I was actually fleshing this out, we would want to see some more detail about, okay, what are the specific STEM skills that you are trying to increase through your program. So this is simplified, but hopefully that just gives you kind of a basic visual of how this would all look. Okay. Okay, so what we want to have you do now is take another 10-12 minutes or so to continue working on your logic model, and you can go back and continue working on resources and activities, but you may want to get started in looking at outputs and outcomes, and that way if questions arise, we can definitely talk through those. So again, we'll take about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back together and do some final Q&A.